So I know that many people like to spend time in nature, observing and taking pictures of animals. And of course they also want to take nice pictures, but maybe they don't want to spend too much time with looking at the camera menu, reading the quite long manual, reading on internet forums of which settings to use when. So in this video I kind of want to give you a guide of how I set up the R6 Mark II for my type of shooting. The menu is quite complex and big, so I don't want to go into details like which items you can show or hide on the screen. I think this is not so relevant in the end. This is more a bit personal taste. I just want to give you some ideas of how you can assign the buttons to quickly switch to important functions, what autofocus methods are suitable for different situations, a bit about the custom functions, and I just hope this video gives you a nice starting point that with not investing too much time, you get a good starting point for the camera for wildlife photography. And then of course I also encourage you to adapt it to your needs, and I will also give you some hints of some settings that I would maybe change based on your shooting style. So let's dive straight into the menu of the R6 Mark II, and I reset everything. So I will now change all the settings that I changed, or the ones that I think are really important for wildlife photography, and I will also mention some that I would really keep at the base settings. And as you can see, we have different tabs in the menu, and I will also mark them as chapters in the video so you can skip to the section that is interesting for you. Let's start with image quality. Here obviously I want to shoot RAW, and I prefer C RAW over the normal RAW. Why? Just because the file size is smaller. This means that we can shoot more frames in a row before the camera starts slowing down. And this is especially important with the R6 Mark II because the buffer size is not huge and the write speed is not perfect just due to the SD cards. If we move to the next page here, I think one aspect that might be interesting is the ISO settings. Generally I shoot all manual, so I put this already to a manual value here. If you shoot auto, then maybe the auto range here is of interest of you. And if you shoot in the aperture priority mode, you might want to think about the minimum shutter speed. However, I don't recommend the aperture priority mode so much anymore because it kind of cannot know how fast your bird is moving. So if you prefer to have some more automatic setting, I would highly suggest that you shoot manual with aperture and the shutter speed set, and then you can still have the ISO on automatic if you want to have a bit, if you want to worry less about the camera settings. Otherwise, I would put the auto lighting optimizer highlight tone priority off, just because I had the feeling in the past sometimes with certain cameras at least they slowed the camera a bit down or made the writing to the card slower, and it doesn't really affect the raw file in the end anyway. The flicker shooting we will not need if we shoot in natural light. The white balance, auto white balance is not bad, but I sometimes see that it's changing from one picture to the other and I don't like it, and overall I feel it's a bit too cold sometimes. So I just put it to daylight. I leave it there for 90% of the images. In some of I might switch to the cloudy settings, but anyway, as long as you shoot raw, you can change this afterwards. The color space, I know our Adobe RGB would be a wider color space, but again, if you shoot raw, I really think it's not so important. I also prefer to just set a picture style and not have this on automatic. So just that I have the same kind of, if I review my pictures on the camera monitor, I have the same settings, so to speak. The lens corrections, I tend also to turn them off for bird photography, since I also realized that sometimes this slows down the camera a bit, and that's something I prefer not to have in bird photography. And again, for raw files, not so important. I also disabled the high speed noise reduction because it makes it harder for me to see the details in the pictures when I review them if the noise reduction is too aggressive, and once more it can slow down the camera. I don't do a lot of these multiple exposures. I think the last one I did was like 4 years ago, so I will just skip this. The raw burst mode, on the other hand, is a really interesting feature on this camera, which, as you might know, allows you basically to capture pictures from the moment you half press the shutter, and only if you completely press it, it will effectively record this to the card together with the pictures you shoot afterwards. So here the first menu item is the raw burst mode. This just puts all the shoots in the continuous shooting in one container. This is only interesting in my opinion if you also have the pre-shooting enabled. So I do this from time to time, but not as my standard settings. I will show you afterwards how you can quickly access this setting. The focus bracketing is more interesting, I think, for macro, insect, flower photography. I already made a tutorial on the R7, how I used it, and it's really basically the same as on the R6 Mark II. So if you want to check this video, it's linked in the video description. The drive mode, obviously I don't want single. I take either the high-speed continuous shooting, or if there's more speed, I even go for the high-speed continuous plus, which with the electronic shutter gives me 40 frames per second. The silent shutter function, you might think it's nice to have a silent shutter, and in general I agree. That's also one of the reasons I use the electronic one. However, you can also have it silent without having this activated, and if you activate this function, it automatically deactivates some other. So for example, in some situations I might want to go back to the electronic first curtain to avoid rolling shutter or something like this, and I cannot do this if the silent shutter function is enabled. So I prefer to have this off. The shutter mode, however, I put it to electronic for 98% of the cases, I would say. The release shutter without card, I would really turn this off. So if you don't have a card in the camera, at least the camera is completely blocked and doesn't act like it's taking pictures and not saving them anywhere. The image stabilizer here, I cannot change this just because I have a lens that has image stabilizer with a switch. So you will not see this properly, but if I change it here on my lens, it changes on the camera menu. This is maybe more relevant if you have a lens that doesn't have an IS switch or just doesn't have IS actually. The customize quick control is if you go on the Q menu, how you can, what shows up there. I will not see this here. I would deactivate the shutter, touch shutter, so that if you touch somewhere on the screen, it's not taking a picture, but just focusing. And the image review, I also prefer to turn this off so that if I take a burst of images, it's not showing me the image, but rather the live feed again that I can continue shooting. The display simulation, I would put this to exposure simulation. So on the screen or on the viewfinder, you see more or less how bright your image will be afterwards. In some situations, however, I like to see the image as bright as possible. More like I would see it through an optical viewfinder, and this is mostly if I underexpose heavily and if I shoot in backlit. Then I might toggle between the two settings, between the exposure simulation and the optical viewfinder simulation, just because the exposure simulation is once nice to have the settings, and afterwards it's much easier to obtain focus if you have then the optical viewfinder simulations. At least that's my impression. So I assigned a button to switch between these two, and I will show you this a bit later. The display performance I put to smooth, just that I have a smoother frame rate. Might use a bit more battery, but more important for me that I have a smooth display if I track birds in flight. The movie recording, this is effective or important if you use just the red rec button here on top. If you go into the movie mode itself, then you have all your settings different, but here I just put it to 4K 60 and I leave the rest as it is. So now the autofocus, that's quite a big chapter. These are just my settings. Again, you might want to choose different ones. I highly recommend to put the servo autofocus so it tracks our subject. If we keep the autofocus field on it and we go closer or farther away, it tracks it. That's what we want for animal photography in general. Afterwards, I go for the spot area, which is the smallest and is the most precise one. And I will actually turn off these features here, like that it should track the subject through the whole frame. I will turn it off. And it should also not detect a subject at all. I just want that it focuses where I tell it to focus and not look for, birds or whatever around this point. The eye detection, left, right, I will leave this on auto. Switching tracked subject is like if it locked on an initial subject and then it finds another subject, another bird that it thinks it's more the main subject, what should it do? I leave this on 1. In general, I prefer if it sticks to the original one, but maybe if a bird is closer than the original one, it's nicer if it switches. So for me, 1 was a nice compromise. For the cases here, you can fine-tune it a bit, the autofocus, and you have some presets that are based on sports, but they also work for wildlife. In general, I just use the 1 without any adjustments. For flight photography, I might do some adjustments. I will just show this to you in a bit. Here, these ones, I just leave them as they are. You can maybe limit the autofocus areas if you want, that you can toggle through them faster, and the ones you really don't need, you can just deactivate them. Here I increase the sensitivity of the AF point selection. This just makes it quicker to move the autofocus point around, which is quite nice. A super cool feature that luckily we have since a while is the orientation linked autofocus point, meaning if I shoot horizontally and I have the autofocus point rather in the top of the picture, and then I turn the camera 90 degrees, I don't want that then the autofocus point is on the left side of my picture. I still want to have it on top, and this just means I can basically select two different autofocus points, one for vertical, one for horizontal, and it will kind of memorize where they are in each orientation. So that's very useful. Otherwise, I'm not changing much here. You might want to experiment with the touch and drag settings if you like to use the thumb on the viewfinder, on the screen, if you have your eye on the viewfinder to move the autofocus point around. I usually just use the joystick for this, so I don't use it. The manual focus peaking, I turn it on. It can be useful if you have the focus set to manual. This basically never happens for me in wildlife photography anymore, but it's nice to have it for this one situations in 5 years when it happens. The electronic full-time manual focus just allows you to, without switching the lens to manual focus, to interfere with the focus basically. I have this turned on. I prefer to be at any time able to change the focus. It has a slight disadvantage that it could also mean if you have the camera on a beanbag or something, if you now move the focus ring a bit, it's defocusing, so you might need to see what works better for you here. This one is if only effective in one shot. I put it here to one shot and magnify, so if I'm in one shot I acquire focus and then I fine-tune, then it magnifies on the area and I can adjust the focus a bit nicer. The rest I leave here. The focus ring orientation might be nice if you're coming from from Nikon or Sony, that focus in a different way. You can go back to the focusing that you are used to before. I've been shooting Canon for years, so I leave it like this. So this is my standard autofocus setting. I will show you in a few minutes how I customize buttons for different autofocus settings. So we'll get to this in a second. The play menu is something I will really just go through very quickly because most of the settings are not so important. I like the magnification to put this here on actual size and from focus point. So this means if I zoom in a picture, it goes really to the 100%. So I see really the fine details and it goes on the focus point. I leave this part here, the rate button. I also leave it to the star rating because afterwards I can use this in my digital workflow. You can also say that you want to protect the respective image as you prefer. Here, important to put the highlight alert in my opinion. This shows you which areas of the pictures are like overexposed and blown out. And I also usually have the AF point displayed, so this just helps me to realize if images are sharp or not, and if they are blurry, was it a problem with the autofocus or was it like more a problem with something else? That's for me just another tool. The playback grid, I usually don't use it for bird photography, but obviously up to you. The communication settings, I will not go through this because it's a bit tedious and again for wildlife often not so important. Maybe sometimes you want to couple it to a smartphone for a remote trigger or for transferring images. There are other tutorials on the internet that cover this. I just usually put it on airplane mode just to save a bit of battery if I don't need this Bluetooth and Wi-Fi enabled. So here the range menu is for the setup. You can set if pictures and videos are recorded on the same card or separately. I think here again it's personal preference if you want to have this separated. If you want to use one of the other functions, you will see that if you have this enabled, you cannot choose the others anymore. So what I here usually have for the rec option is the auto switch card. So this means it saves to card 1 but until it's full. As soon as it's full, it switches to card number 2 and continues shooting there. You can record JPEGs and RAWs individually, or you can record to multiple cards. Multiple meaning 2 cards in parallel, so you kind of have a backup. Otherwise, there is not much I changed here. I disabled the beep completely, so the camera makes no noise. If you want no noise overall, but you want some feedback if you press the shutter, you can put this enable, and for volume, put off everything except for the shutter volume. Again, I put everything to disable. The power saving settings, I'm changing them a bit. I think the camera goes to dim the screen, power off and everything way too quickly. And I generally prefer if this stays on for a bit longer, just uses a bit more energy, but at least then I'm ready all the time for shooting. And for me, this here is a nice compromise, but again, this might depend a bit on you. Here I'm basically not changing anything. Quite important for me is the shutter at shutdown. So this means the shutter goes down if you turn off the camera, which protects the sensor if you change lenses. Well, there is less of a likelihood that dust is entering the camera, and especially the sensor, I should say. I will come back to this one here in a second. I will explain you why. So now we go to the custom functions that we can set here. The first one I actually left as it is. In the second, I changed the same exposure for new aperture. This is quite cool if you work with a zoom lens like my RF 100 to 500. It starts at 4.5 at 100 millimeter, it ends at 7.1 at 500. So if I zoom and I'm in complete manual mode, since the aperture is decreasing, the image will get darker and darker. Here I can say, okay, I want that it uses the ISO to compensate for that. Why not the shutter speed? I feel for bird photography, the shutter speed will not change much, and if at all, it will change in the opposite direction, meaning if I zoom from 100 millimeter to 500, I don't want it that it makes a longer shutter speed. So I keep it just on ISO here. The same is actually useful if you shoot with a 600 millimeter prime and then you attach a tele extender. You will also lose one stop of light, and the ISO is compensating for this. The rest here I leave. You can change the directions of the dial if you're more used to from another camera, as you prefer. I customize the buttons here, and I will just show you how I set them up exactly. So basically, I'm not a big fan of back button autofocus for my type of shooting, so I leave this one here for the shutter. I leave the video on the record button, and the MFN button, as I mentioned before, I use this to toggle between the exposure simulation and the optical viewfinder simulation, which is quite nice. Again, if I have backlit, I can leave it in the standard to see how the exposure is, or if I want to do a low key and underexpose heavily. And then I can switch to the optical viewfinder simulation once I have the correct exposure, and see much better the details, see if the focus is hitting, and I also have the feeling the focus in general works better. Then the next one, the AF on, I have set this to switch to a specific autofocus function. And I will try to show this to you here, demonstrate this to you here quickly. So I go to this one, and with info I select the details. So basically on the right hand side we have all the settings, and on the left hand side a small check mark. If this check mark is there, it means it's overriding the settings you had before with these new settings that you're specifying here. If you leave the check mark and you leave it blank, it means it keeps the current settings. So keep this in mind. So I want to set this up in general. As you might recall, before I had like a spot autofocus with no subject detection. I want that the AF on kind of switches to subject detection and tracking. So I select a bit a wider area. I chose the zone 1. You can also change the size of each zone. I want that now it tracks over the whole frame, so detection in the zone. Once it has it detected and it leaves the zone, it can track it. And obviously the subject to detect is animals. The spot detection here is not important anyway, if this works only for cars. So if I put here it should take it, you can see I cannot select it anymore. It can only be selected if I switch to vehicles here. But anyway, this doesn't matter. The eye detection is again on auto. The camera should decide left or right eye. The tracking sensitivity, this depends a bit on the situation. Sometimes I put it to -1, sometimes at 0, and the acceleration, deceleration tracking as well. I sometimes change these settings a bit depending on which shooting situations I'm in. So basically I can now go back with the menu, and if I press OK, these settings are like saved. The next one I want to talk about is here on the AE lock button. I basically, or the star button if you want, I basically switch to a shooting mode or shooting function that I assigned before, and this is super useful. So basically, let's imagine I take pictures of waterfowl, they're not doing much, and maybe I don't have so much light. So I prefer to keep my ISO down and just shoot with a 640th of a second or something. And then suddenly there's action and one is taking off. Now with the press of one button, I can switch to a different shooting function. I should show you now how. If I press on info, I can, for example, say I want the shutter speed to be 1/2500th of a second. Obviously now, since I don't have a control of the light, I want to keep the ISO on automatic. I have the all metering mode. I will leave the exposure compensation, but this doesn't matter if I was shooting manual before. But anyway, the white balance should also be kept as it was before. Here for the AF area, I go for a bigger AF area because there is action happening, so I prefer it has a bit of wider range to choose. Again, the tracking should be activated. We want to detect animals, eye detection automatic. And here I'm in general trying to make the autofocus more sticky and also make it prepared for more erratic movement. So maybe I would even put this to +2. This depends a bit on the situation. If I have a bird that is like flying towards me, it goes from 0 to a quick movement. So it helps the camera to say that the animal is accelerating or decelerating quickly. And the AF operation I have not ticked on here. Let me quickly explain how this works. You can see through my viewfinder that the image is quite underexposed now. I'm in manual settings. If I now press this star button, you see that the exposure goes to this automatic one, and you see it already detects within this big zone my animal, my chamois, but it's not starting the autofocus. Only from the moment I press the shutter button, it's starting the autofocus and now also tracking it. So the next button, the autofocus selection, I leave it. The depth of field preview button, I reassigned this to quickly activate or deactivate the raw burst mode. For the set button, I tried different things. I'm actually not using it so much, but with this setting here, even if I'm in the traditional spot autofocus, I can switch to spot autofocus with subject detection. As I said, I didn't make the best experience with it, so I'm not sure how much I will use it or if I will change it in the future. The multi-controller, I would activate this to direct autofocus point selection so that you can move the autofocus point without pressing another button first. And the lens autofocus function button, I have this to autofocus off, but not all my lenses have this function button, so not the most relevant. So afterwards I can customize the dials as well. Here I basically left everything on the default values. I turned the control ring on the lens off just because many of my lenses don't even have a control ring, and so I cannot assign this something like an important function because I don't have it on all of them. And that's basically it. Now, if I quickly exit the menu here and go on the shooting information, I think this could be a quite nice setup for standard bird photography with the spot autofocus enabled and these settings. So I basically want to register this to a custom shooting mode. So I go to the menu, to the range with the 6 custom shooting mode, and register this to C1. If you want to learn more about custom shooting modes, how they work, how you can set them up with some examples as well, and also about the My menu, then please check out the video here on top right. If you enjoyed the video, I would be happy if you subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and see you in the next one.